the new God of peace, the new gods of peace, a new God of peace, the new goddess of peace, the new goddesses of peace, a new goddess of peace, the old God of peace, the old gods of peace, a old God of peace, the old goddess of peace, the old goddesses of peace, a old goddess of peace, the greater God of peace, the greater gods of peace, a greater God of peace, the greater goddess of peace, the greater goddesses of peace, a greater goddess of peace, the lesser God of peace, the lesser gods of peace, a lesser God of peace, the lesser goddess of peace, the lesser goddesses of peace, a lesser goddess of peace, the greater spirit of peace, the greater spirits of peace, a greater spirit of peace, the lesser spirit of peace, the lesser spirits of peace, a lesser spirit of peace, the major God of peace, the major gods of peace, a major God of peace, the major goddess of peace, the major goddesses of peace, a major goddess of peace, the minor God of peace, the minor gods of peace, a minor God of peace, the minor goddess of peace, the minor goddesses of peace, a minor goddess of peace, the superior God of peace, the superior gods of peace, a superior God of peace, the superior goddess of peace, the superior goddesses of peace, a superior goddess of peace, the inferior God of peace, the inferior gods of peace, a inferior God of peace, the inferior goddess of peace, the inferior goddesses of peace, a inferior goddess of peace, the ancestor God of peace, the ancestor gods of peace, a ancestor God of peace, the ancestor goddess of peace, the ancestor goddesses of peace, a ancestor goddess of peace, the ascendant God of peace, the ascendant gods of peace, a ascendant God of peace, the ascendant goddess of peace, the ascendant goddesses of peace, a ascendant goddess of peace, the descendant God of peace, the descendant gods of peace, a descendant God of peace, the descendant goddess of peace, the descendant goddesses of peace, a descendant goddess of peace, the transcendent God of peace, the transcendent gods of peace, a transcendent God of peace, the transcendent goddess of peace, the transcendent goddesses of peace, a transcendent goddess of peace, the future God of peace, the future gods of peace, a future God of peace, the future goddess of peace, the future goddesses of peace, a future goddess of peace, the present God of peace, the present gods of peace, a present God of peace, the present goddess of peace, the present goddesses of peace, a present goddess of peace, the past God of peace, the past gods of peace, a past God of peace, the past goddess of peace, the past goddesses of peace, a past goddess of peace, the God of peace, the gods of peace, a God of peace, the goddess of peace, the goddesses of peace, a goddess of peace, the half God of peace, the half gods of peace, a half God of peace, the half goddess of peace, the half goddesses of peace, a half goddess of peace, the vessel of peace, the vessels of peace, a vessel of peace, the person of peace, the persons of peace, a person of peace, the persona of peace, the personas of peace, a persona of peace, the personage of peace, the personages of peace, a personage of peace, the personality of peace, the personalities of peace, a personality of peace, the personification of peace, the personifications of peace, a personification of peace, the image of peace, the images of peace, a image of peace, the imagination of peace, the imaginations of peace, a imagination of peace, the belief of peace, the beliefs of peace, a belief of peace, the thought of peace, the thoughts of peace, a thought of peace, the word of peace, the words of peace, a word of peace, the action of peace, the actions of peace, a action of peace, the reaction of peace, the reactions of peace, a reaction of peace, the situation of peace, the situations of peace, a situation of peace, the circumstance of peace, the circumstances of peace, a circumstance of peace, the relationship of peace, the relationships of peace, a relationship of peace, the number of peace, the numbers of peace, a number of peace, the formula of peace, the formulas of peace, a formula of peace, the equation of peace, the equations of peace, a equation of peace, the symbol of peace, the symbols of peace, a symbol of peace, the color of peace, the colors of peace, a color of peace, the thing of peace, the things of peace, a thing of peace, the way of peace, the ways of peace, a way of peace, the place of peace, the places of peace, a place of peace, the time of peace, the times of peace, a time of peace, the event of peace, the events of peace, a event of peace, the result of peace, the results of peace, a result of peace, the crown of peace, the crowns of peace, a crown of peace, the peace king, the peace kings, the peace kingdom, the peace kingdoms, the peace king's subject, the peace king's subjects, the peace king's dominion, the peace king's dominions, the kingdom of peace, the kingdoms of peace, a kingdom of peace, the peace queen, the peace queens, the peace queendom, the peace queendoms, the peace queen's subject, the peace queen's subjects, the peace queen's dominion, the peace queen's dominions, the queendom of peace, the queendoms of peace, a queendom of peace, the peace prince, the peace princes, the peace princedom, the peace princedoms, the peace prince's subject, the peace prince's subjects, the peace prince's dominion, the peace prince's dominions, the princedom of peace, the princedoms of peace, a princedom of peace, the peace princess, the peace princesses, the peace princessdom, the peace princessdoms, the peace princess's subject, the peace princess's subjects, the peace princess's dominion, the peace princess's dominions, the princessdom of peace, the princessdoms of peace, a princessdom of peace, the leader of peace, the leaders of peace, a leader of peace, the follower of peace, the followers of peace, a follower of peace, the natural form of peace, the natural forms of peace, a natural form of peace, the supernatural form of peace, the supernatural forms of peace, a supernatural form of peace, the temporal form of peace, the temporal forms of peace, a temporal form of peace, the spiritual form of peace, the spiritual forms of peace, a spiritual form of peace, the age of peace, the ages of peace, a age of peace, the awakening of peace, the awakenings of peace, a awakening of peace, the realm of peace, the realms of peace, a realm of peace, the dimension of peace, the dimensions of peace, a dimension of peace, the purpose of peace, the purposes of peace, a purpose of peace, the manifestation of peace, the manifestations of peace, a manifestation of peace, the source of peace, the sources of peace, a source of peace, the origin of peace, the origins of peace, a origin of peace, the ancestor of peace, the ancestors of peace, a ancestor of peace, the descendant of peace, the descendants of peace, a descendant of peace, the lineage of peace, the lineages of peace, a lineage of peace, the forefather of peace, the forefathers of peace, a forefather of peace, the foremother of peace, the foremothers of peace, a foremother of peace, the mask of peace, the masks of peace, a mask of peace, the armor of peace, the armors of peace, a armor of peace, the champion of peace, the champions of peace, a champion of peace, the elemental art of peace, the elemental arts of peace, a elemental art of peace, the elemental science of peace, the elemental sciences of peace, a elemental science of peace, the elemental principle of peace, the elemental principles of peace, a elemental principle of peace, the agent of peace, the agents of peace, a agent of peace, the agency of peace, the agencies of peace, a agency of peace, the amplifier of peace, the amplifiers of peace, a amplifier of peace, the amplification of peace, the amplifications of peace, a amplification of peace, the aura of peace, the auras of peace, a aura of peace, the power of peace, the powers of peace, a power of peace, the authority of peace, the authorities of peace, a authority of peace, the might of peace, the mights of peace, a might of peace, the dominion of peace, the dominions of peace, a dominion of peace, the melody of peace, the melodies of peace, a melody of peace, the rhythm of peace, the rhythms of peace, a rhythm of peace, the dance of peace, the dances of peace, a dance of peace, the music of peace, the musics of peace, a music of peace, the spirit of peace, the spirits of peace, a spirit of peace, the people of peace, the peoples of peace, a people of peace, the mark of peace, the marks of peace, a mark of peace, the promise of peace, the promises of peace, a promise of peace, the vision of peace, the visions of peace, a vision of peace, the language of peace, the languages of peace, a language of peace, the sound of peace, the sounds of peace, a sound of peace, the secret of peace, the secrets of peace, a secret of peace, the knowledge of peace, the knowledges of peace, a knowledge of peace, the understanding of peace, the understandings of peace, A understanding of peace, the wisdom of peace, the wisdoms of peace, a wisdom of peace, the revelation of peace, the revelations of peace, a revelation of peace, the strength of peace, the strengths of peace, a strength of peace, the fortress of peace, the fortresses of peace, a fortress of peace, the city of peace, the cities of peace, a city of peace, the nation of peace, the nations of peace, a nation of peace, the civilization of peace, the civilizations of peace, a civilization of peace,